H.P. Lovecraft and the mythos he developed from the insanity-inducing Elder Ones, Cthulhu and his legions of great deep ones poised to erase humanity when the stars are right, to the most horrid volume imaginable, the dread Necronomicon, have emerged from pop obscurity in the early 20th century and dismissal to become pillars of pop culture, literature, music, and beyond. His works are known for their brooding antiquarian interest, architectural and ancestral decay, profound, indeed even deeply racist fear of the other, beings whose cosmic scale and indifference threaten sanity and civilization, and occult knowledge that threatens to unlock the vault of eldritch nightmares from beyond the gulf of the stars. While Lovecraft and his often contradictory mythos have been explored at length, I want to actually explore just what occult influences operated and inspired Lovecraft. Was his mythos consciously or even unconsciously infused with ancient occult lore? What exactly were the esoteric literary resources that Lovecraft relied upon to build out his mythos? And to what degree does authentic historical occult knowledge actually make its way into his tales? Just what are the occult origins of Cthulhu, the Necronomicon, Yog Sothoth, the Pnakoptic Fragments and Nyarlathotep? If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism, including curated playlists on a wide range of topics. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon with a one-time donation or with the cool little super thanks option down below the video. But now, let's turn to the occult influences on H.P. Lovecraft and his mythos. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. I suspect that the Venn diagram between people interested in esotericism and the works of H.P. Lovecraft and the mythos derivative therefrom form something of two pretty tight circles, if not just one. His world is populated with forbidden tombs, horrible cults, necromancer, alchemist, ancestors, dreadful aliens summoned through ancient rites, even the shocking intersection of advanced physics and witchcraft lore. Lovecraft's literary universe has inspired an army of writers, RPG creators, artists, and musicians. In fact, I was listening to Metallica's Call of Cthulhu while I was actually writing these very lines. And even contemporary occultists who have felt that Lovecraft had somehow tapped into something deeply and magically powerful, perhaps something at the very outer reaches of his own psyche. Though, given all of this, I think what drew me into Lovecraft's world as a young person was also something that drew me into the world of Edgar Allan Poe. Dreadful, ancient books of occult knowledge. Indeed, just as Lovecraft will name drop dozens of such forbidding tomes, he's perhaps mimicking a device already present in Edgar Allan Poe. For instance, in one of my favorite tales, In the Fall of the House of Usher, we actually get a glimpse into the literary landscape of degradation and madness of Usher, with such forbidding volumes as the Belphegor of Machiavelli, a novella involving demonic possession by one of the most controversial authors in all of history, the scribe of what sometimes is called the Handbook of Evil itself, Il Principe, the Prince. Further, we have Emmanuel Swedenborg, the great theosophist, his Mystical Heaven and Hell, a mystical text par excellence with visions of the afterlife, including hell, of course, along with the Directorium Inquisitorum of Nicholas Emmerichs. This is an early inquisitional manual which evokes all the classic imagery of heresy, torture, witchcraft, and the dread fires of the auto de fe. While these volumes are never explored at length in any of Poe's tales, or there's not really even much evidence that Poe read them himself, their very existence in the tale, just the name dropping, lends gravitas, ancient authority, and a sense of forbidden knowledge to an already macabre and gloomy atmosphere in the decaying house of Usher. The book, like all tools, is a form of prosthesis. The hammer, the cup, the ladder are all specialized extensions of our own body. They're prosthetic aids. The book, too, is a kind of prosthesis, but perhaps the oddest of all. It's a kind of dislocated mind, a bank of memory impressed upon paper and bound up, at least in former times, onto the very flesh of other creatures, sometimes other people. We can hear their thoughts, sometimes in their original language, of people reaching back millennia, from Enheduanna for the first faltering words of a child this very day, from ancient Sumeria to now. Thus, the book is already a kind of ghostly thing in which we gain and lose memory, thus bearing out Thoth's prophetic warning about writing in Plato's Phaedrus. I suspect there is already something otherworldly, something eldritch about the survival of these spectral voices, and all the more so when the content of those volumes contain secrets, esoteric speculations, or occult rituals meant to reach well beyond human perception, their authors long moldering in the earth before they even reach our hands. Thus, while Poe will name drop only a few volumes here and there, Lovecraft's tales are imbued with references, quotations, and name drops to a veritable library of the arcane and horrible, of volumes both real and imagined, thus giving his tales a sense of being haunted by past minds whose knowledge of occult or otherworldly secrets is simultaneously apparent to us on the references in the page, and yet hidden to us. Some of these works are so remote, and some of them never really existed at all. To trace out this occult literary landscape of H.P. Lovecraft's tales, let's separate three different categories. Fictional, invented volumes, often taken from other weird literature or just invented by H.P. Lovecraft himself, while others are name-dropped or sometimes from which quotations are taken. The second are non-fiction volumes concerning the occult or the supernatural that influenced or actually informed Lovecraft himself. His knowledge of the esoteric is derived from these volumes. The third are historical non-fiction works, which Lovecraft merely references or name drops, their reliance being actually pretty doubtful. Let's deal with each of these types in turn. As for fictional invented volumes like the Necronomicon, I'm going to spend the least amount of time here for a really simple reason. There are already dozens of videos and book-length monographs about these books, so they're not going to get a great deal of attention here. But these volumes are either invented by other authors of weird literature, such as the Book of Eibon by Clark Ashton Smith, the Cultes de Ghouls of August Derleth, a book like the De Vermis Mysteriis by Robert Bloch of Psycho fame, or the slightly misworded Onesprechlichen Kulten by Robert E. Howard. Lovecraft, for his part, would just often name drop these volumes, often after actually kind of badly translating their titles into Latin for added eldritch effect. Another, the Book of Thoth, actually does have a kind of quasi-historical reality, but it wasn't known to Lovecraft at the time. But, of course, the Egyptian god of magic and writing meets well with the sinister messenger of the Lovecraftian deities, Nyarlathotep. Of course, the Necronomicon, or the Kitab al-Zif, and the Pnakoptic Fragments would be invented by Lovecraft himself, like much in the way of the stories from his childhood fantasies or the terrible dreams that plagued him. Lovecraft would actually go on to create extensive quotations from the Necronomicon into these tales, and even provide a very rich and detailed history of the volume, further conjuring it into reality out of the realm of pure imagination. The title of the work, Necronomicon, is probably actually a riff on a Roman work of astrology called the Astronomicon. I have a copy of it over there, a text Lovecraft actually knew from his interest in astronomy. Needless to say, the Necronomicon would go on to a celebrity life all of its own, both in works of art and fiction, but also in contemporary occult practice, and more on that here in a bit. While the Pnakoptic Fragments haven't gone on to such fame, they're actually mentioned in about a dozen of Lovecraft's tales. In fact, second only to the Necronomicon, though mostly in the less popular dream cycle tales, and seem to have the unique feature that they actually predate the advent of human beings at all, giving them, at least in my opinion, an even more otherworldly cosmicism kind of feel. While the Necronomicon always just struck me as kind of normie evil, the Pnakoptic Fragments always seemed downright alien and truly Lovecraftian. The second group of volumes are those that Lovecraft name drops in his tales and may or may not have influenced him, much less even been read by him. I suspect mostly the latter of those. These works can be grouped into roughly 4 different subgroups. These are works on alchemy, works on principally medieval cryptography, works on witchcraft, of course, and miscellaneous esoterica. Let's take this group in that order. The works on alchemy almost all appear in Lovecraft's novella unpublished during his lifetime, however, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which makes sense given that alchemy and necromancy play a central role in that story. In fact, one of the earliest weird tales written by Lovecraft as a youth was about an alchemist, so it was clearly a long-standing interest of Lovecraft's. Though, to be honest, there's nothing especially interesting about this grab bag of alchemical works. Some of them are just alchemical classics, like the Turbo Philosophorum, which I've actually made an entire episode about. You can check that out in the card. Other volumes here are somewhat misattributed or just misnamed. For instance, Trithemius didn't write a book called De Lapide Philosophico. That was probably Libavius, although there are dozens of texts on the Philosopher's Stone. You can sort of pick one out of a hat. Geber's work is actually more properly De Investigatione Perfectionis, not Liber Investigationis. There's no such work just called Hermes Trismegistus, but the Corpus Hermeticum or any number of alchemical works from the Latin Hermetica might have just equally been in mind. One can easily imagine 15 works named Hermes Trismegistus. Though more germane to that tale, the Charles Dexter Ward tale, is the persistent myth that Artephius, who actually lived allegedly for 1,000 years through the use of life-expanding alchemy. It's also worth noting that in that tale there are some quasi-Paracelsian elements are present, especially to that weird opening quote via Borellus, that quotation which Lovecraft actually took from a translation of Mather's in his own first edition of 1702, one of the few actual antiquarian volumes that Lovecraft himself owned. In fact, it was sort of a relic that had been passed down through his family. The second group here are primarily books of medieval cryptography and are mostly collected from Lovecraft's important tale, the Dunwich Horror, one of his classics, which also contains some of the most detailed analysis and quotations from the Necronomicon. Again, this makes some sense given that the characters need to translate that very horrible volume for the practice of some of their occult rituals. I think they're summoning Yog Sothoth for whatever reason. Again, aside from the name dropping here, very little is actually made of the contents of those volumes, and for, well, a very simple reason. The same is just with those alchemy volumes I mentioned a minute ago. Much of Lovecraft's knowledge of alchemy, magic, and the occult, he's actually simply extracting these title names from the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. For instance, from the article on cryptography or the one on alchemy, you can kind of look at them. I've actually included them in the link, and you can look through and see where he's just picking them out. In fact, in a letter from the mid-1920s, Lovecraft admits as much, though I think there's actually a little more to the story here, more on that in a bit. I guess it's also worth mentioning that Della Porta also wrote a really important volume on natural magic that was incredibly popular, and the work of Trithemius that he actually mentions in the story on the Dunwich Horror, among other really wonderful and interesting things that book contains. It also contains the first appearance of the so-called alphabet of the witches, which is reproduced in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, and I really can't imagine that if Lovecraft had known that there was an alphabet of the witches in a book name that he just name dropped, that he would have foregone such a lurid detail. To my knowledge, Lovecraft actually never references Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, but he does mention John Dee in connection with the fictional translation of the hulking, I think 800-page Necronomicon into English, but no mention of John Dee's famed conversations with angels or his so-called Enochian language. There's just no evidence, again, that Lovecraft knew about any of that stuff. The next group of texts are those specifically concerned with witchcraft. These would include several really famous inquisitional volumes, mostly for the dread task of witch hunting, again mirroring Edgar Allan Poe's reference to the Directorium Inquisitorum of Nicholas Emmerich. The hardcore Yankee Cotton Mather's works are prominent, including the 1702 Magnalia Christi Americana, but also the more known and infamous Wonders of the Invisible World, which argued forcefully for the reality of diabolical witchcraft in the colonies, something that would have probably already struck continental ears as kind of old-fashioned and weird. Of course, this work was heavily informed by the also name-dropped Saducismus Triumphastus, which is the best name ever, a reactionary work of 1681 arguing against the emerging skeptical position on witchcraft, again likening skeptics to the ancient Jewish Sadducees, which were said to have rejected the existence of angels and demons and even the afterlife. This book argues forcefully that there really is such things as spirits and especially diabolical witchcraft. Now, Lovecraft does refer to this work as terrible and the 1595 Demonolatreia of Remy as shocking, though I suspect not because of what they actually argued, but for mostly just added flair. Of course, the 1595 Demonolatreia is in fact shocking when Remy claims to have killed no less than 800 persons, non minus octogentos, for witchcraft over a period of just 15 years. However, that number is probably heavily inflated. Only about 120 people were tried and executed in that region at that time, but that's still 120 innocent people that he murdered. Lovecraft could even have consulted the Montague Summers translation of that book, translated as Demonolatria, published in 1930, but I don't think of any evidence, or at least I don't know of any evidence he actually read the Montague Summers translation. I don't suspect that Lovecraft's Latin was strong enough to read it in the original. While not an antiquarian volume, and not even apparently owned by Lovecraft, at least it's not in the catalog made when he died, is the important volume The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray. Now, this book has been since discredited. It actually held that the persecuted witches of Europe were, in fact, a religious survival of pre-Christian pagan fertility cults. This book was highly influential, even though at the time there were serious methodological problems acknowledged. I still, in fact, hear this claim made, especially in some neo-pagan circles. This is sort of the "we are the daughters of the people that you couldn't burn." This work was especially important for Lovecraft's world of cultic worship of the alien beings of his mythos, though this is often integrated with his unfortunate white supremacist beliefs, such that the non-white races maintained ancient cultic connections, such as with the famed Call of Cthulhu text, or the dreadfully xenophobic horror at Red Hook. Again, a work that Lovecraft knew, at least at some level at least, but it's probably again functioning more to add flair than substance to his tales, although this idea of survivals of ancient pre-Christian religiosity is a staple, in fact, in many of his tales. The last group here is admittedly a bit of a grab bag, less than it is a coherent group of text. We have the Golden Bowel, the much heralded work of comparative religion, which was highly influential at the time, though now heavily discounted. The Book of Dizyan, which emerged from Blavatsky and theosophical circles, the story of Atlantis and the lost Lemuria, a very popular text of the time, and it meets well with Lovecraft's interest in pre-human civilizations and the sunken corpse city of Relied, where Cthulhu lies imprisoned and dreaming. The historically foundational text of the Kabbalah, the Zohar, also gets a name drop along with the Ars Magna et Ultima of Raimondo Lull, both in the text of Charles Dexter Ward, though again, much can be made of both of these texts. Lovecraft just name drops them, quickly moves on, and both texts, I think, function basically as occult window dressing. What can we conclude from this survey? Perhaps the most deflationary thing is that Lovecraft mostly extracted these titles, and the titles really alone, from the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which again I've put a link to in the description if you want to look up alchemy, magic, and witchcraft to see exactly what Lovecraft was looking at when he was developing his tales. And again, he admits this in private letters of the time. This was no secret or anything. There's virtually no reason to think, to my mind, that the occult lore of any of his tales, as much as there is any actual occult lore, has much more depth to it than that. Now, it's possible that out of the depths of his psyche he conjured profound symbolic forces, as later occultists would in fact argue. But from the literary point of view, Lovecraft's knowledge of magic, the occult sciences like alchemy or Kabbalah and witchcraft, were primarily akin to a contemporary writer getting such information from Wikipedia. Although, I guess the Encyclopedia Britannica does sound somewhat more special, being in Latin and all, whatever. Though, to my mind, that doesn't discount his tales in the least. In fact, it actually reveals his peculiar literary genius. He employed these various occult volumes in exactly the way a writer should, to evoke feelings of awe, mystery, dread, and dangerous curiosity. I mean, so much curiosity that I'm looking them up now to make a video. Yeah. In that way, who cares that he didn't read the Zohar or random alchemy text or Trithemius or whatever? He used the idea to get them to that great effect. And that's the point of weird tales like these. They're not meant to be academic analyses. They're meant to evoke what he called the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. When he quotes those Latin volumes like that, and you have no idea what they're supposed to mean, they're sort of vaguely terrifying, that's the purpose. And in that way, he was and is profoundly successful in his use of these volumes. Though aside from the Encyclopedia Britannica, there might be another source for Lovecraft's knowledge of the esoteric and the occult. The best resource here is actually the catalog contents of his library when he died. From here, without doubt, the largest resource that we have would have been the ocean of weird literature written by his friends and colleagues, already mentioned in the fictional works above. Remember, he's drawing on all these works of weird literature to mine out many of these odd texts to populate his works. In addition to those texts, Lovecraft did have a very small collection of occult-related text, aside from that 1702 volume of the Magnalia Christi Americana. These would include various volumes on mythology, the Arabian Nights, that whole Al-Azif business, fairy tales, and even a couple of volumes on haunted houses, appropriately. In addition to these, he also owned a copy of the famed, though now pretty dated, Egyptian Book of the Dead in the Budge edition. Again, probably a further inspiration for his own Necronomicon, the Book of Dead Names, even though that's not quite what it means. Lovecraft also owned the volume of Walter Scott. This is his Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft, a work first published actually in 1830, but this work exercised enormous, considerable influence on the rise of the Gothic literature in the 19th century, directly inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula in many ways. Its analytical style would have also deeply appealed to H.P. Lovecraft, I pretty strongly suspect. Further, he also owned the more up-to-date 1920 Encyclopedia of Occultism by Lewis Spence, which is still in print, by the way. This volume, again, a highly erudite and non-credulous take on topics in the occult, stands up surprisingly well even today. While it's not clear that either of these texts really deeply informed Lovecraft more than the aforementioned Encyclopedia Britannica, it is conspicuous that he had them in his library. Finally, a couple of odd outliers in his collection are The Theory of Pneumatology by the German contemporary and friend of Goethe, Johann Heinrich Jung Stilling. This work is actually an attack on materialism, a position that Lovecraft himself held doggedly his entire life, and it actually argues for the existence of spirits, ghosts, etc. This work is like 400 pages long. Another work, a kind of Pamlet, were the Apparitions and Miracles at Knock. This is a text detailing Catholic apparitions in Ireland, and actually are among the very few pro-supernaturalist texts in his collection. Though, to my knowledge, neither of these works really influence or make their way really into his tales, and why he had them exactly is a bit mysterious and worthy of more research. Of course, by the 1920s and 30s, Lovecraft could have availed himself of a wide range of historical occult texts. Brown's holdings just are extensive. He could have walked in there and had access to a huge amount of historical texts, along with new translations and studies like the historical magical texts such as the Lesser Key of Solomon, some of the texts being collected and translated by A.E. Waite, the monumental studies of Lynn Thorndike, which were being published during his lifetime, even contemporary books of magic that were being published by folks like, well, the great beast himself, Aleister Crowley. Though I think that Lovecraft, the strict materialist that he was, would have had very little interest in magic as was being developed by Crowley, considering the scorn that he heaped upon the spiritualists and the theosophists. In fact, he had Houdini's book on that subject, on spiritualism. In fact, Lovecraft ghost wrote for Houdini. But anyway, and both of them shared a deep hatred for spiritualism and its rampant abuses. Of course, Lovecraft's personal philosophical commitment to scientific materialism and his apparently thin knowledge of the occult did not prevent his works from having an enormous influence on the very occultism that he would have no doubt dismissed as nonsense. By the 1960s, his works were making a splash in both literary and occult circles. Kenneth Grant would argue that Lovecraft unlocked occult truths in his vivid and often terrifying dream life, despite his, again, self-conscious commitment to materialism. The 1972 Satanic Bible would contain Lovecraftian rituals, and even the barbaric speech of some of the tales was part of the ritual melodrama of contemporary LaVeyan Satanism, which certainly had a flair for that kind of stuff. The Lovecraft mythos would also prove decisive in the emergent world of chaos magic, where it proves basically monolithic, and accelerationist nihilism, i.e. Nick Land and his ilk. The Necronomicon itself would spring from the pages of the mythos into reality several times, from the Evil Dead franchise to the 1977 mashup of Lovecraftian, Aleister Crowleyan, and pseudo-Sumerian mythology in the famed Simon Necronomicon. Now, I'm sure all of this would have him rolling in his I Am Providence grave, but the vicissitudes of his creations are well beyond his control at this point. Until the stars are right. H.P. Lovecraft's forays into the esoteric and the occult were, aside from maybe his dream life, rather superficial and primarily in the interest of, I think, adding spooky flair to his tales. But who can fault him for that? After all, he was a writer of weird tales, not an academic of the occult, much less a practitioner. But his creations, the world of his mythos, were so well imbued with the profoundly authentic feeling of the occult. And that's what matters, I think, that they've done one better. They've become part of the contemporary occult world, and in that way, Lovecraft has done more than proven his worth as a writer of weird tales, but also as a profound inspiration to contemporary esoterica on virtually every front. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.